Before I tell you how 96 houses ended up on my land, before I tell you how an entire homeowners association smiled in court like they'd already won, you need to understand one thing. This story didn't start in a courtroom. It started with dirt, quiet land, the kind of land people ignore, until it's suddenly worth millions. So let me take you back. Soft pause. I bought the land 22 years ago. Back when nobody wanted it. Back when real estate agents laughed when I said the zip code out loud. It was 14 acres on the edge of a growing town, flat, boring, surrounded by nothing but scrub grass and an old broken fence that leaned like it had given up on life. People said, "What are you going to do with that?" I said, "Nothing." That's the point. I didn't buy it to build, I didn't buy it to sell, I bought it because it was quiet. Because it was mine. I paid cash. Clean deed. Surveyed, stamped, recorded. I put it in a safe, forgot about it, and went on living my life. Years passed. Then the town exploded. If you've ever seen a sleepy place suddenly get discovered, you know the feeling. One coffee shop becomes 5. A 2-lane road becomes 6. The word development starts popping up in city council meetings like a bad rash. That's when the letters started coming. At first, they were friendly. Developers asking if I'd sell. Offering numbers that sounded big until you realized how big the land had become. I said no. Every time. Then the letters stopped. And honestly, I forgot about the land again. Until one morning, I got a phone call from my cousin. He said, "Hey, are you building houses now?" I laughed. "What are you talking about?" He said, "I just drove past your land. There are bulldozers on it." Silence. I remember gripping the phone harder than I needed to. My brain tried to reject the sentence. Bulldozers, on my land? I drove out there that same day. And what I saw didn't feel real. Heavy machinery. Survey stakes. Workers in bright vests. A giant banner stretched across the entrance that read, "Coming soon, Maple Ridge Estates. 96 single-family homes. Luxury HOA community. Clubhouse. Pool. Walking trails. All on my land." I pulled over so fast the gravel sprayed like fireworks. I walked up to a guy holding a clipboard and said, "Who's in charge here?" He didn't even look nervous. He smiled. "Development manager. Can I help you? You're building on my property." He chuckled. Actually chuckled. Like I just told him the sky was green. "Sir," he said, "this land was acquired 2 years ago. Everything's approved." I told him my name. He checked his clipboard again. And then he frowned. That was the first crack. He said, "One moment." He walked away. Made a phone call. Looked back at me. Looked back at the land. His smile didn't come back. An hour later, a woman in heels showed up. City planner type. Confident. Sharp. She said, "There must be a misunderstanding." I said, "There isn't." I told her the parcel number. The boundaries. The fence line that used to be there. I told her things only the owner would know. She said, "Well, according to our records, the HOA owns this land." That sentence changed everything. Because I knew something they didn't. I had the original deed. Clean. Recorded. Never transferred. Never sold. Never signed away. Someone had built an entire neighborhood on land they didn't own. And here's the part most people won't understand. I didn't stop them. I didn't file an injunction, I didn't rush to court, I didn't put up a sign or chain the gate. I went home, and I waited. People ask me all the time, "Why didn't you shut it down immediately?" Because sometimes, the best move isn't the loud one. Sometimes, the best move is letting someone finish digging their own hole, then handing them a shovel receipt in court. Over the next 2 years, I watched. I drove by occasionally. Watched the streets get paved. Foundations poured. Frames go up like skeletons. Roofs. Windows. Paint. 96 families signed contracts. Took loans. Picked countertops. The HOA formed. Board members elected. Rules written. Fines planned. They named streets. They planted trees. And all of it sat on land my name was still attached to. Every month, I checked county records. Nothing changed. No transfer. No easement. No sale. Someone had messed up. Badly. And the higher the houses rose, the more expensive that mistake became. I hired a lawyer quietly. One of those older guys who doesn't talk much but listens like he's counting bullets. He looked at the deed once and said, "Do not say a word to them." That's when I knew this was going to get interesting. By the time construction finished, the neighborhood looked perfect. Model homes. Flags. Balloons. Grand opening signs. That's when I filed the lawsuit. The HOA laughed. They said it was a clerical error. A boundary confusion. A technicality. They said, no judge would ever let 96 homes be affected by one piece of paper. I smiled when they said that. Because that piece of paper was older than their entire HOA. And in court, paper beats concrete every time. But the real shock? Wasn't what I asked for. It was what the judge said when he read the deed out loud. And that is where this story turns from shocking to legendary. The lawsuit hit them like an earthquake. Not because they didn't expect a fight, developers always expect noise, but because they never expected me. I wasn't a rival builder, I wasn't a greedy investor, I wasn't a guy trying to cash out. I was just the name on the deed. And that terrified them. When the HOA board got served, they held an emergency meeting that same night. I know this because months later, during discovery, I read the minutes. Pages of confident language slowly dissolving into panic. At first, they called it an administrative oversight. Then they called it a title discrepancy. By the third page, someone had written, "What if he's right?" That question spread through the room like smoke. Because if I was right, everything they stood on, literally, belonged to me. They hired a high-powered law firm. The kind with glass offices and partners whose names were engraved on the building. They filed motions fast and loud, trying to bury me under paperwork. Their strategy was simple: overwhelm me until I backed down. But here's the thing about patience. When you've waited 22 years for land to appreciate, waiting a few more months while someone else builds on it feels easy. I didn't attend HOA meetings, I didn't talk to homeowners, I didn't give interviews. I let their fear grow in the silence. Behind the scenes, my lawyer was calm. Almost amused. They're arguing equity, he told me one afternoon. They're saying it wouldn't be fair to enforce your deed. Is fairness part of property law? I asked. He smiled. No. Ownership is. The HOA tried another angle. They claimed adverse possession, they claimed implied consent, they claimed the city approval somehow erased my rights. Every argument sounded impressive, until you remembered one simple fact. They never owned the land. Not for a second. What actually happened, we later discovered, was almost embarrassing. Years earlier, a junior title officer at a development company had pulled the wrong parcel number. One digit off. My land got bundled into a neighboring sale by mistake. No one double-checked. The city approved plans based on faulty documents. The HOA trusted the developer. The homeowners trusted everyone. And I stayed quiet. That silence became my strongest weapon. Construction finished. Families moved in. Kids rode bikes on streets that technically didn't exist for them. Barbecues happened. HOA fines were issued for trash cans left out too long. All of it sat on a legal illusion. Then came the first hearing. The courtroom was packed. HOA lawyers in suits. City attorneys. developers. Even a few homeowners sitting nervously in the back, clutching folders like life rafts. I walked in alone. No entourage. No drama. Just a man and a deed. The judge was old school. Gray hair. Reading glasses. The kind of judge who didn't care how much money was in the room, only what the law said. He asked one question. Who holds the recorded deed to parcel 14B? My lawyer stood up and handed it over. The room went quiet as the judge read. Line by line, stamp by stamp, signature by signature. The HOA attorney cleared his throat and said, Your Honor, enforcing this would displace 96 families. The judge didn't look up. That's unfortunate, he said. But displacement doesn't transfer ownership. That sentence hit harder than a gavel. The judge ordered a full title review. Independent survey. County verification. 3 months later, the report came back. The land was mine. Every inch. The HOA's tone changed overnight. They wanted to talk. Suddenly, there were settlement offers. Low at first. Then higher. Then desperate. They offered to buy the land at market value. I said no. They offered double. I said no. They asked what I wanted. I told them, I want what the law says I already own. That's when fear turned into anger. They accused me of being cruel. Of waiting on purpose. Of letting families suffer. But here's the truth no one wanted to say out loud. They didn't suffer because of me. They suffered because someone built houses without checking who owned the ground. That mistake just finally came due. The HOA tried one last move. They filed for an emergency injunction, claiming public harm. The judge denied it in under 5 minutes. He said, This court does not reward negligence. That was the moment the power shifted completely. Because now, it wasn't about if I won. It was about what happens next. And that's when I made my decision. A decision that shocked the HOA, shocked the homeowners, and made the courtroom go silent when my lawyer announced it. I wasn't evicting anyone. I wasn't tearing anything down. I was doing something far worse, and far more legal. And when you hear what it was, you'll understand why the HOA called it the most expensive mistake in the county's history. When people think about land ownership, they usually imagine fences, signs, or maybe a house sitting on top of it. What most people never realize is that land ownership is invisible power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't announce itself until someone else builds their entire world on top of it. After the judge confirmed the land was mine, the courtroom energy changed. The HOA lawyers stopped posturing. The developers stopped showing up. Even the city attorneys started sitting a little straighter in their chairs. Everyone understood the same thing at the same time. The foundation of this entire neighborhood belonged to someone who had done nothing wrong. That's when my lawyer asked me a simple question in private. Do you want to be right, he said, or do you want to be smart? I told him I wanted to be both. Legally, I had options. Ugly ones. I could demand removal of the structures. I could file for trespass damages dating back years. I could seek lost use compensation for every square foot. Any of those paths would have crushed the HOA financially and turned 96 families into collateral damage. The law allowed it. But the law also allowed something far more elegant. Ground leases. Most people hear the word rent and think monthly payments and angry landlords. But a ground lease is different. A ground lease says, you own the house. I own the earth under it. It's slow. It's stable. And it lasts decades. So instead of eviction notices, I sent lease offers. 96 of them. Each homeowner received a letter explaining the situation in plain language. No legal threats. No arrogance. Just facts. The land had always been mine. The court confirmed it. Their homes were safe. But the ground beneath them would now be leased. Some people cried when they read it. Others got angry. A few showed up at my lawyer's office demanding answers. I didn't meet any of them in person. Not because I didn't care, but because this wasn't personal. This was structural. The HOA board tried to stop it. They claimed I was undermining community stability. I reminded them that community stability starts with verifying ownership before pouring concrete. The lease terms were fair. Long-term. Transferable. Fixed increases written in. No surprises. No sudden spikes. Anyone who sold their home could pass the lease on to the buyer. Anyone who stayed could stay indefinitely. But here's what made the HOA panic. The leases bypassed them completely. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't the highest authority in the neighborhood anymore. They controlled paint colors and mailbox styles, but I controlled the ground itself. Their power shrank overnight, and they hated that more than anything. They tried to challenge the leases. Filed objections. Claimed I was acting in bad faith. The judge disagreed. He said, "This is a lawful and reasonable use of property rights." That sentence sealed it. Within weeks, homeowners started signing. Not because they loved the situation, but because reality doesn't ask for permission. Banks approved it. Title insurers adjusted. Life moved on. Then something unexpected happened. The numbers came in. The combined annual ground rent exceeded what the HOA collected in dues. And unlike HOA fees, ground rent didn't depend on board elections or community votes. It was contractual. Locked in. Predictable. The HOA realized they weren't just embarrassed. They were irrelevant. Their last attempt was public pressure. They went to the local news. Tried to paint me as a villain. The headline read something like, "Landowner holds neighborhood hostage." But the story didn't land the way they hoped. Because when reporters dug deeper, they found the truth. The mistake. The skipped title check. The rushed approvals. The arrogance. Public sympathy shifted fast. I never gave an interview. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for me. Months passed. The anger faded. People adapted. Kids still played. Holidays still happened. The neighborhood became normal. And underneath it all, the land kept doing what land always does. It appreciated. Every refinance, every sale, every improvement added value to my asset. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply owned what I had always owned. One afternoon, my lawyer called me and laughed. "You know," he said, "they could have bought this from you 20 years ago for nothing." I looked out the window and smiled. "They didn't," I said. And that's when the HOA made their final, most desperate move. They tried to buy me out. Not the land. Me. They offered a lump sum that would have made most people sign instantly. Enough to disappear, retire, and never think about that town again. I thought about it for exactly one night. And then I said no. Because some victories aren't about cashing out. They're about proving a point that lasts longer than money. There's a specific sound power makes when it slips through someone's fingers. It's not loud. It doesn't crash or explode. It's quiet, like air leaking out of a tire. And once you hear it, you know there's no fixing it. That sound filled the room during the HOA board meeting where everything finally unraveled. I wasn't there, of course. I didn't need to be. By then, my presence had become something worse than a threat. It had become a fact. And facts don't argue, they just exist. One of the board members said a sentence that later showed up in the meeting transcript. A sentence so simple, yet so revealing, it still makes me smile. He said, "We don't actually control this neighborhood anymore." That was the moment. Up until then, the HOA had told itself a comforting story. They said this was temporary. They said lawyers would fix it. They said someone higher up would step in. They said the homeowners would rally behind them. None of that happened. What did happen was far more dangerous to an HOA than a lawsuit. People stopped listening. Once the ground leases were signed, homeowners realized something unsettling. The HOA couldn't threaten foreclosure anymore. Couldn't pretend they were the final authority. Because the real leverage in housing isn't rules. It's land. And the land wasn't theirs. Complaints flooded in. People challenged fines. Others ignored letters. Board members argued among themselves. Elections turned hostile. Attendance dropped. Authority dissolved piece by piece. The HOA tried to tighten rules to reassert control. Bigger fines. More notices. Stricter enforcement. That only made it worse. Because now homeowners had leverage too. They'd learned a lesson the hard way: always ask who really owns what. Some homeowners even contacted me directly. Not to fight. Not to beg. Just to understand. They asked questions about the lease. About the future. About stability. And I gave them answers. That's when trust quietly shifted. Not toward the HOA. Toward me. I never raised rents unexpectedly. I never changed terms. I never played games. Predictability became my strongest asset. While the HOA panicked, I stayed boring. And boring, in situations like this, feels safe. The city took notice next. Officials who once approved permits without blinking suddenly became very interested in procedures. New policies appeared. Extra checks. New layers of review. All designed to make sure this never happened again. Too late for Maple Ridge Estates. The developer vanished from the conversation entirely. Sold what little stake they had left and walked away. Their reputation never recovered. No one wanted to be associated with the company that built 96 homes on land they didn't own. But the real turning point came quietly. A homeowner tried to sell their house. Normally, that's routine. List. Show. Close. This time, buyers asked questions. About the lease. About the land. About long-term security. The sale still went through. At full market value. That sale did something powerful. It proved the neighborhood wasn't broken. It was different. And different scared the HOA more than broken ever could. Because broken can be fixed. Different means you've lost control of the story. Property values stabilized. Then climbed. Banks adjusted underwriting. Appraisers adapted. Life went on. And every time a house sold, the truth became harder to deny. The land situation wasn't a disaster. It was a correction. Behind closed doors, the HOA board fractured. Some members resigned. Others blamed each other. Accusations flew. Lawsuits between board members followed. All of it stemmed from one original sin: assuming ownership instead of confirming it. One night, my lawyer forwarded me an email from the HOA's attorney. Just one sentence. "We underestimated your resolve." I laughed out loud when I read it. Resolve had nothing to do with it. I hadn't fought. I hadn't pushed. I hadn't even spoken much. I had simply waited. That's the part people struggle to understand. They think strength always looks like aggression. Like shouting. Like forcing outcomes. But real strength sometimes looks like patience so disciplined it feels invisible. Months later, the HOA officially amended its bylaws. Reduced scope. Reduced authority. Reduced relevance. They became what they should have been from the start: a neighborhood association, not a kingdom. And through it all, my land sat quietly underneath everything. Unmoved. Unbothered. Doing what land has done for centuries. Holding value. One evening, I drove past the neighborhood at sunset. Kids were playing basketball in a driveway. Someone was grilling. Porch lights flickered on. If you didn't know the story, it looked peaceful. Ordinary. That's the irony. The most dramatic property dispute in county history ended not with bulldozers or evictions, but with normal life continuing on land everyone once assumed belonged to someone else. And just when things seemed settled, just when the HOA thought the worst was behind them, they received a letter that changed everything again. Not from me. From the IRS. Because it turns out, when ownership changes assumptions, taxes change realities. The IRS letter arrived on a Tuesday. No warning. No phone call. Just an envelope stamped with authority, the kind people instinctively hesitate before opening. The HOA president opened it during lunch, expecting routine paperwork. By the time he finished reading, his food was cold and his hands were shaking. Because the letter wasn't asking a question. It was stating a fact. According to updated property records, the HOA did not own the land beneath Maple Ridge Estates. And because of that, years of tax filings were now incorrect. Very incorrect. For years, the HOA had reported assets they didn't legally possess. They had depreciated land they didn't own. They had structured budgets, reserves, and long-term plans around property assumptions that were never true. The IRS didn't care how it happened. They cared that it happened. Once land ownership was clarified in court, the county updated its records. The county shared those updates with the state. The state shared them with the federal system. And like dominoes falling in slow motion, a single corrected entry triggered an audit. HOAs live and die by paperwork. They exist on filings, classifications, and compliance. And now, every form they had submitted for years was being re-examined through a lens they never expected. The audit uncovered something the HOA hadn't even considered. They weren't just wrong about ownership. They were wrong about liability. Because if the HOA didn't own the land, then certain expenses they'd written off didn't qualify. Certain reserve funds weren't structured correctly. Certain fees had been collected under assumptions that no longer held legal weight. Penalties followed. Interest followed. Legal costs piled up. The HOA board tried to stay calm in public, but behind closed doors, panic returned with a vengeance. Emergency meetings became weekly. Then bi-weekly. Then almost daily. They raised dues. That backfired. Homeowners, already tired and distrustful, pushed back hard. Attendance at meetings exploded, not with support, but with questions the board couldn't answer. Why are we paying for mistakes we didn't make? Why didn't anyone check the land records? What else don't you actually own? The HOA tried to point fingers. At the developer. At the city. At me. None of it worked. Because the IRS doesn't care about blame. They care about compliance. The financial strain cracked what little unity the board had left. One member resigned publicly, stating he refused to be the fall guy for systemic negligence. Another followed. Then another. Within months, the HOA was operating on temporary appointments and legal extensions just to stay functional. Meanwhile, something interesting happened on my side. The same corrected records that triggered the HOA's audit also clarified my tax position. The land had always been reported correctly under my name. No surprises. No penalties. Just clean continuity. In fact, the county reassessed the land value. Upward. Because now, instead of vacant land, it was income-producing property with long-term leases attached. Predictable revenue. Stable occupancy. Low risk. My accountant called it the cleanest appreciation scenario he'd seen in decades. The HOA noticed. They saw the contrast. Their finances deteriorating while mine quietly strengthened. No drama. No chaos. Just structure doing what structure does. That's when the tone of their communication changed completely. No more accusations. No more public statements. Just quiet, formal letters. They wanted relief. They asked if I'd consider restructuring the leases to help them stabilize dues. If I'd defer payments. If I'd partner with the HOA for the good of the community. I declined politely. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Partnership requires trust. And trust requires competence. They had demonstrated neither. Homeowners began to adapt in their own ways. Some formed informal groups to reduce reliance on the HOA. Others volunteered to manage community spaces independently. The neighborhood slowly decentralized. Ironically, it became more peaceful. Less enforcement. Less noise. Less politics. And underneath it all, the ground leases kept doing their quiet work. Every month, on time. Every year, as agreed. Then came the breaking point. The HOA's insurance carrier dropped them. The audit findings spooked underwriters. Liability questions went unanswered. Premiums skyrocketed. Coverage narrowed. Without insurance, the HOA couldn't legally operate as structured. They were cornered. One final emergency meeting was called. Attendance was high. Emotions were raw. Voices were raised. And in that meeting, someone asked the question no one wanted to ask. What happens if we dissolve? Silence followed. Because dissolving an HOA is like admitting defeat. It means giving up authority, structure, and control. It means acknowledging that the system failed. But it also meant something else. Freedom. The idea spread fast. If the HOA dissolved, homeowners would still own their houses. The leases would still stand. The community would still exist. Just without a board pretending to be more powerful than it was. The vote wasn't unanimous. But it passed. Maple Ridge Estates HOA dissolved quietly, with paperwork filed and signatures signed. No press release. No announcement. Just an ending. And with that, the final illusion collapsed. There was no enemy left to fight. No villain to blame. Just land, homes, and people adjusting to reality. When my lawyer told me the news, he asked how I felt. I thought for a moment. Relieved, I said. Because the story was finally nearing its end. But before it could truly close, one last thing had to happen. A courtroom. One final hearing. And a judge who wanted to make sure this never happened again. The final hearing wasn't supposed to be dramatic. On paper, it was procedural. Clean up. Loose ends. A formal acknowledgement that the HOA no longer existed and that the land leases were now the governing structure beneath Maple Ridge Estates. But courtrooms have a way of turning quiet moments into lasting ones. When I walked in that morning, the room felt different from the first time. Fewer lawyers. Fewer suits. No reporters. No crowd of anxious homeowners. Just a handful of city officials, my attorney, and the judge who had seen this case from the beginning. The judge looked older than I remembered. Or maybe the case had aged him. He flipped through the file slowly, pausing now and then like he was rereading history, not paperwork. He started by summarizing the facts. The mistaken parcel. The unchecked title. The construction. The leases. The audit. The dissolution. As he spoke, I realized something. This case was no longer about me. It was about what happens when speed replaces diligence. The city attorney stood and spoke next. For the first time, there was no defensiveness in his voice. Just caution. He acknowledged the failure of review processes. He admitted reliance on developer-provided documents. He promised reforms. The judge listened without interruption. Then he spoke. This court has watched an extraordinary situation unfold, he said. Not because the law was unclear, but because it was ignored. You could feel the weight of that sentence settle into the room. He continued, explaining that property law exists precisely to prevent chaos. To create certainty. To ensure that when something is built, it stands on more than hope. Then he turned his attention to the city. Approvals are not ownership, he said. Permits do not replace deeds. And convenience does not excuse negligence. Those words weren't just for the people in the room. They were a warning. The judge issued his final orders. The leases were affirmed as valid and enforceable. The land ownership was reconfirmed without limitation. The dissolution of the HOA was formally recognized. But then he did something unexpected. He added a directive. The city was ordered to revise its development approval process. Mandatory independent title verification. Cross-checking parcel numbers. No more reliance on single-source documentation. This case, he said, would be referenced as precedent. A lesson carved into policy. He looked at me then. For the first time directly. You exercised restraint, he said. The law allows force, but it does not require it. This court recognizes that. I nodded. Not because I felt proud, but because I felt finished. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. Like a storm had passed. My lawyer shook my hand and said, "You changed how this town builds things." I hadn't intended to. But sometimes, the consequences of patience ripple farther than action ever could. In the weeks that followed, word spread through development circles. Quietly at first. Then louder. Lenders tightened requirements. Title companies double-checked everything. Developers slowed down. No one wanted to be the next Maple Ridge. Homeowners settled into a new normal. Without an HOA, they organized differently. Informally. Cooperatively. Disputes got handled face-to-face instead of through fines and letters. The neighborhood matured. I drove through occasionally, not as an owner asserting control, but as a steward observing balance. The land beneath those homes felt complete. Like it had finally been acknowledged. One evening, I stopped at the edge of the property where the old fence used to be. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across roofs and streets that hadn't existed when I first bought the land. I remembered the laughter when I bought it. The disbelief. The jokes. Why there? This was why. Not the money. Not the outcome. The proof. Proof that ownership matters. That patience compounds. That silence, when chosen carefully, can be louder than any argument. And still, one question remained. People kept asking me the same thing. Would you do it again? The answer came easily. Yes. Not because it was easy. Not because it was profitable. But because it was right. And because sometimes, letting someone finish what they started, is the only way to reveal what they never owned. People love dramatic endings. They want fireworks, revenge, villains dragged away in shame. They want a final punchline that feels like justice wrapped in spectacle. This story didn't end like that. It ended quietly. The way most real power stories do. After the court issued its final order, there was no celebration. No victory lap. I went home, made coffee, and sat at the same table where that deed had rested in a fireproof box for more than 2 decades. I took it out one last time. The paper was old now. Yellowed slightly. Corners soft. The ink still clear. My name written in careful handwriting that had outlived developers, board members, and entire organizations. That piece of paper had outlasted 96 houses. And that's the truth people underestimate. Concrete cracks. Wood rots. Companies dissolve. Committees disband. But recorded ownership endures. Over the following months, life normalized in ways that surprised everyone. Without an HOA, neighbors talked more. They solved problems face-to-face. Disagreements didn't escalate into legal threats. Kids still played. Lawns still got mowed. The neighborhood breathed easier. The leases faded into the background, doing their quiet work. Predictable. Stable. Boring. Exactly how good systems should be. Sometimes homeowners would recognize me at a distance. A nod. A wave. No resentment. No fear. Just acknowledgement. They knew I wasn't there to disrupt their lives. I never had been. I was just the ground they stood on. Developers stopped calling me entirely. Not because I was untouchable, but because the lesson had traveled faster than any lawsuit ever could. Title checks became sacred. Deeds were verified twice, then a third time just to be safe. Maple Ridge became a whispered case study. Don't rush, people would say, remember that landowner. I never asked for that reputation. But I didn't reject it either. One afternoon, a young investor reached out to me. Nervous. Curious. He asked what the secret was. What move had made the difference? I told him the truth. I didn't move at all. That confused him. So I explained. Everyone rushes to react. To prove. To defend. To dominate. But the strongest position in any conflict is ownership combined with patience. When you truly own something, you don't have to shout. You don't have to threaten. Time speaks for you. Looking back, there were moments I could have interfered. Could have stopped construction. Could have warned people earlier. But that wouldn't have fixed the core problem. It would have just created chaos without clarity. By letting the process complete, the mistake revealed itself in full. No deniability. No half measures. Just truth, standing on its own foundation. Some people still call what I did ruthless. They're wrong. Ruthlessness would have been destruction. Evictions. Ruin. What I chose was structure. I allowed consequences to land exactly where responsibility belonged. The homeowners weren't punished. They adapted. The HOA wasn't attacked. It collapsed under its own assumptions. The system corrected itself because it was forced to look at reality. That's not cruelty. That's accountability. If there's one lesson this story leaves behind, it's this. Never assume ownership, never trust convenience over verification, and never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who's willing to wait. Because while others are busy building, expanding, and declaring victory, someone else might already own the ground beneath their feet. And when that deed finally comes out in court, it doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It simply exists. And existence, in the world of law and land, is the final word. I closed the fireproof box and slid it back into its place. Not as a trophy. Not as a weapon. But as what it had always been. Proof. Proof that patience beats speed, proof that paper can outweigh concrete, proof that real power doesn't rush to be seen. It waits. And when the moment comes, it speaks just once. Then goes quiet again.